Thank you. Sometimes you listen to introductions and you wonder, is this really me? Especially in a room filled with weapons experts, I wonder what I'm going to give you all that you probably heard over and over. And so when I was asked to come and do this keynote, I told myself I wanted to be as practical as I could be, because I think in all of our interactions, we tend to miss the practicality. And by missing the practicality of the work that we do, we miss how it impacts the lives of individuals. So I'll start with thanking the organizers, the Global Challenge Foundation, the Geneva Disarmament Platform, the Chatham House Royal Institute for International Affairs, and the Observer Research Foundation. To all of you panelists, participants, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I'm really honored to be here at this New Shape Forum on Weapons Governance. In 2003, during the Liberian peace talk, a group of us women were at the venue of the talks protesting each day. We were neither parties to the conflict, funny, right, nor observers at the table. We came as women from diverse backgrounds, across religious and people's groups, to put pressure on the belligerent to sign an agreement that would lead us to peace. During the days of negotiations, various committees were being set up as part of the plan for the ARAs: rehabilitation, reconciliation, restructuring, and all the different arrows that come with the one-size-fits-all peace deals that are signed around the world. The Committee on the Rehabilitation of the Military was set up, and the Nigerian General Ishaya Williams, decided he wanted 2 members of the protesting women to be a part of the Committee on Restructuring the Army. That was really unprecedented. I don't think in the history of any peace agreement, anyone has done such bold move. Etwida Cooper, my mentor and colleague, and I were very excited to be in the room. The next morning, we presented ourselves in the room where we were supposed to sit and join in the discussion around the military restructuring. We felt happy to be at this space because it presented us a unique opportunity to bring to light the issues in relationship with the military and the community, some of the issues that we felt contributed to people's inability to trust the military, that kind of led to communities supporting the rebels and supporting the war by extension. We arrived at the meeting and were told by one of the very white and very powerful nations that we didn't have the military expertise, and so we were not allowed to sit in the committee room. The Nigerians objected and insisted that we sit in the room. And I remember vividly General Williams making a point that still resonates with me today. Whose protection is the military for? If indeed it is for the people, for civilians, then why should they not be involved in decisions that shape how the military is structured and governed? His comments has been a guiding principle of my work. Individuals must have opportunities to make meaningful input and decision over the issues that influence their lives, even more so when it comes to life and death issue. So join me as I speak to you from a peace builder's perspective on driving change through inclusive collaboration. Like I said earlier, I'm going to use a lot of practical examples to drive home some of what I think we need to hear. In many places where wars have been fought, it is the women at the community level who are the champions for change. They are the ones who primarily start every conversation about peace before the international players flies in. In Liberia, it was the women at the community level who started all of the humanitarian work, all of the conversations around peace. Today, in Cameroon, I was privileged to lead a peace exploratory mission there earlier this year. A group of women were the first to actually get the government and the belligerent at both sides in the southwest-northwest. Group of women asked them to cease fire for a day so that they could do something called the Day of Lamentation. And the idea was these women would take over the streets and cry so that the world would finally turn their attention to all of the death and destructions that has been happening over the last 3 years. However, with all of these initiatives by women from Congo to Sierra Leone, Burundi to northern Nigeria, it is an open secret that every conversation around peace, around disarmament, around political participation becomes not just a male-dominated conversation, but a conversation between and amongst men who hold the greatest knowledge on arms, ammunitions, and militarism. Women are seen as non-legitimate actors in this space. In Liberia, our movement was routinely dismissed and mocked as toothless bulldogs. We were just women. The phrase just women, in my opinion, have become a phrase that is used to dismiss the voice of women and make invisible the space that they are supposed to be involved with. What will we know about guns? What would women know about disarmament or power? It's extraordinary that we still need to make a case for change in these dynamics. 1915 at The Hague, women gathered and it was the beginning of WILF. And at that gathering, they came together to make their voices heard on the world war that was happening. I read the document, the book was written by Jane Addams, and I read their outcome documents, and I keep reading that document because from 1915 to 2019, the conversation has not changed. It is a sad state to think that militarism and everything around militarism should continue to be a conversation only by men who hold guns or by men who find themselves in spaces where guns are created. Today, we find ourselves asking questions about how do we change the dynamics of the governance of arms. And the whole concept of just women continue to leave out the critical voices of women. In 2003, some of the women in the communities that we work in told us they knew when attacks were imminent. How did they know? By increase in sales at the local markets in their villages. 2, increase in the number of petty traders. And most times these petty traders were carrying only 1 or 2 items. 3, increase in the number of soccer matches between and amongst villages. And they could swear on their lives that when these soccer teams were coming between their different towns, that was when guns were being transported under the guise of boys coming to play soccer match. My good friend who passed some years ago, Deka Abdi, from the Wajir region in Kenya, said the women would know when an attack was imminent because of the restlessness of the cattle. They already knew that the cattle could smell the gunpowder from miles away and they could take action. Another friend of mine who worked on community policing in a very, very difficult situation told us that when the country was ready to do a crackdown, it was the old ladies who stayed at home all through the day who was able to show them where guns were being hidden and where terrorists were hiding their guns to strike in different parts of their country. These explanations, in my opinion, are most often not considered in the analysis of conflict, given that they are too simple. How do you sit at a peace table and talk about boys selling soccer matches, restless animals? But when you take your time and do an analysis and spend some time talking about these things, at the end of the day, they can actually help to end or prevent major attacks from happening in communities. The question we must ask ourselves, even as we try to simplify some of the involvement of community, local actors, especially women, why is it so hard for us to include the voices of the most unlikely? Why are conversations about weapons and wars so exclusive when the damages caused are inclusive and widespread? Why do we struggle to implement the inclusion of non-professional voices when it has been proven over and over and again that an inclusive and collaborative approach to any problem is the most efficient and effective way of solving said problem? After the signing of the peace agreement, the women of Liberia decided they were going to engage the peace process in Liberia. We came from protesting to wanting to be a part of the implementation, including those parts that are usually or traditionally the military aspect. We spent hours going back and forth to the UN, and I'm sure some of you in this room are quite familiar with the Liberian story. We had a SRSG who came from Texas, had been to Kosovo. He was American, and technically he was the expert on Liberia. He would listen to no local voice. He was bringing in the expertise from Kosovo, his expertise from Kosovo, to end the war in Liberia. It was going to be okay. My boys got this. We know the community. We're going to fly some helicopters around and make sure that things are in order. Well, on December 7, 2003, they decided to hold a symbolic disarmament process. However, prior to holding the symbolic disarmament process, we had tried to engage them, if not to be in their meetings, to be in the community to help disseminate some of the information. The answer was outright no. We did not have the expertise in disarmament and demobilization processes. We decided to focus our attention on the boys in the communities, and some mothers were engaging us to say, our sons have been fighters. People in the community have no idea they fought. We have huge cache of arms in different homes here. We are so afraid for people to know that we have these arms. Can you women please come and escort our boys for disarmament? We agreed, we got there. But first, let me backtrack on the UN's message to community people about disarming. So they gathered a few helicopters, wrote very exclusive language on a white sheet of paper, flew over villages, and dropped them down. And people were supposed to pick those papers up and read that the disarmament process in 2003 was just a symbolic process. December 7, 2003, we arrived at the Barclays Training Center at the Kesali barracks. And instead of 1,000 fighters for symbolic disarmament, probably 10,000 showed up. There were no logistics in place. They had no way of containing the boys. Young men and women standing, brandishing different kinds of weapons, smoking grass and doing cocaine, whatever drug they had, they were doing it in the open. We got there with 80 young men and a huge cache of arms, and we're asking ourselves, what the hell is going on here? We kept saying this is going to turn into a nightmare. by 4 p.m., restless soldiers high on drugs started shooting, and Monrovia fell again. We who had taken 80 young men to be disarmed ended up being protected by 80 young men escorting us out of a place that was too dangerous for us to be. The next morning, we located all of the generals and said we needed to be involved. Since the UN was not willing to talk to us, we talked to the generals, and they were willing to talk to us, and we accompanied them to their meetings with the UN. Long story short, the SRSG decided these Liberian women know too much. I will give them the opportunity to be involved in this armament. Yes, there were problems, but nothing like the community going to war again. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, we've all heard what Einstein said, the definition of insanity. Doing the same thing over and over and expecting a totally different result. It is time for us to step out of our professional network and include and collaborate with individuals that will help us see a different perspective of weapons governance. This choir and my choir in civil society has been singing to each other for a very long time. It's time to include a new set of tunes that will include local people coming to meetings like these and sitting with us and talking about some of the things. The moment in all of this work, we take out the human dimension, and I think this is where we find ourselves in the world that we live in. Everything has gotten so sophisticated that the documents barely reflect the human dimension. This morning we had an interview, and the name of Greta, the little girl with the climate action, kept coming up as the journalists talked to us. And some people may wonder, why is this little girl getting so much traction or gaining so much momentum and so much attention? What Greta has done is what we need to do with weapons governance. She's taken a very sophisticated language and made it human, and people can now relate to it. So all of a sudden, climate action is trending. It's time for us to start thinking about how to bring the human voice, the human face, back into all of these conversations. Weapons, whether small or large, impact their lives in ways that you and I can only imagine. Every negotiation table around weapons governance must include those who suffer the consequence of war. Every document must not just have statistics, but must have stories. In my travels around the world, I find myself in different places. And one of the times I was in a city in the US that has a very high murder rate as a result of gun violence. And the entire time we're having this conversation about gun violence, the head of this particular state, the mayor, kept saying, my numbers are going down. My numbers are going down. The records are showing that my numbers are going down. And I felt very uneasy. So I asked him, Mr. Mayor, by numbers, are you referring to the children that have been killed by the guns in your city? And he said, yes. I said, well, I would suggest that you take it from numbers, because then your strategy will be different. Because by thinking that these deaths, or by normalizing these deaths as statistics, it makes it difficult for us to find a human solution. So all of our solution becomes theoretical. All of our solution becomes big papers and documents that people would hardly read. So it's time for us to bring a human perspective back into the whole conversation about weapons governance. I know people don't like to hear this. This is a technical field. These things are technical, and we need to. But it seems as if in an era where we have something called the Sustainable Development Goals, all of a sudden, every field in the world is now talking about, let's just focus on what we need to focus on. Last week, I was at the Mass General Hospital in Boston, and I'd had no clue because I do not read medical journal. My closest thing to medicine is when I go to the hospital. So I get there and I'm about to give a speech about social justice, and then my colleague said to me, did you read, someone came on your Twitter feed and said so, so, and so. So I took it and read that, is this a coincidence, or is this something that Mass General is trying to do to spite Penn State in Philadelphia? And then I said, what's going on? So one young doctor took the time to explain to us that one of these old guys decided that all of this talk around social justice and medicine is diluting the field, and it's time for us to begin a conversation on just medicine. I had no clue any of these things were happening. But I think where we find ourselves now is to bring the human dimension. I'll take another step and tell you another story. A few years ago, we were at Wilton Park. And it was one of the few times I was in a room with all generals. General Kermit, General Festus Okonkwo, different generals from different armies across the world. And the conversation was around sexual violence. That conversation eventually led to the passing of the Resolution 1820. But in that room, every other general, some of the generals insisted that they did not go to military academy just to protect women during conflict. It was a heated argument in the room. And then a defining moment came about. Festus Okonkwo took to the stage and he put his slides up. General Okonkwo is from the Nigerian army. And of course, from a very patriarchal background. He put a slide up, and it was a case that had taken place in Liberia during the Taylor era. This market woman had been very vocal against the Taylor government and all of the human rights violations that they were perpetuating on the people of Liberia. She was like basically on the radio every day saying things about his government. One morning, her children alerted the authorities that she had been missed. She had been taken by some armed men. They put a search for her, and by afternoon, they found her body. She had been beaten, raped, and murdered. But that was not the thing. What they did to this woman was to take an object, a little tree, and pass it through her vagina straight out of her mouth. That was the image that General Okonkwo put up on that board. And he turned to all of his colleagues in the room and asked them, which of you on your watch as the general in charge can look at this and go home and look at your wife, your daughter, your mother, and still insist that this is not your role to protect women in armed conflict? That was the turning point for the conversation in that room. I think the turning point for the conversation around arms governance is when we bring life, death, destruction, and the practical things that weapons does to the lives of individuals. The more we talk about the treaties that countries are getting out of, individuals in these countries will never understand the impact it's going to have on them. When we break it down, meaning by meaning, to tell them the threat on their everyday lives, they'll begin to understand. Like young Greta has taken climate action and personalized it, and the whole world is now thinking about it. I think we're intelligent enough in the field of peace building to now bring it down to not just this room, but down to. Another example was a few years ago, I was invited by all of the chocolate producers, or some of the chocolate producers in Europe. Every year they gather. And it was a very nice retreat. They had invited me. They were very good to me and my husband, had paid for us to do an additional 5 days. And we walked in the room, it was time to give this speech. Not one cocoa producer from any country in the world was in that room. I asked them to kindly not send for me anymore, as much as I liked the way they were treating me, but that they should rather send for a cocoa producer so that they could stand at that platform and tell these large CEOs of chocolate companies what it is. And it was in that moment that CNN had just done a documentary where they had taken chocolates to Côte d'Ivoire and had given it to children who till the cocoa farm. And they were like, what are these? And said, taste it, and say, this cocoa is this. None of those babies working on those farms had ever tasted chocolate in their entire life. That also changed the dynamics. This group was saying, we want to go into the field every year now to start doing our retreat. How can we bring home this conversation of weapon governance so that someone like me is not intimidated when I'm walking in this room, because they are all educated, primarily men in suits, sitting here with very stern faces and looking at me like, what the hell are you talking about? We have a model that we can all take inspiration from, and that is the UN Sustainable Development Goal. The beauty of the global goals is that it reminds us that for us to be effective in all of our fields, we must see solutions from an interwoven perspective. You cannot talk about peace without talking about education. You can't talk about education without talking about gender. You can't talk about health without talking about decent work. But as you have all of these conversations about these different thematic concerns, you can also have them without the whole conversation around weapon governance. Because in the face of guns and wars, we can't have good education, we can't have gender equality, we can't have safe climate, we can't have anything. So I think the case, from my laywoman perspective, for weapon governance is not very difficult to make, because it's tied to livelihoods, it's tied to life, it's tied to the air that we breathe, it's tied to the future of our globe. And until we begin to position it as that, it becomes difficult for us to have these conversations. It is my hope that as we keep talking, or as you all deliberate about weapons governance, let's take it from up there and bring it down here. Let's take it from those very difficult textbook language and try to simplify it so that if you step out of this room and walk the streets of Geneva and ask someone about the proliferation, this is a very sophisticated country, the proliferation of arms and the nuclear weapon treaty and all of the different things, they won't go, huh? But if you're breaking it down to, do you know that X, Y, Z, and this is tied to the way your future, the future of your children will be seen, that person will take cue and they will be interested. We spend too many times in these rooms at the UN. I told people today that I did not go to the General Assembly because I feel like sometimes it's a waste of your time. Everything has been spoken about before, except that every year the dates are different on the presentations that people make. But if you check in the rooms with all of the different folders over the years, you will see all of these different resolutions and the comments that have been made by people that is all in the same direction. Implementation is a problem, but we'll continue to have a problem with implementation as long as it is above the heads of everyday people. The 17 goals presents a comprehensive policy framework for achieving sustainable development. We must, all of us must develop a comprehensive system to integrate and coordinate the interrelated components of weapons governance. Collaborative and inclusive networks locally, regionally, and globally. And most times when we talk about locally, people tend to think that we'll bring local civil society. Over time, the word civil society means professors, eloquent individuals, and not individuals who are actually on the ground facing the problem. So when we talk about civil society, we're speaking civil society to include those who probably have never gotten into the airplane to come to any place, or to include some individuals that we need to do translation for. But until we do these things and shift the dynamics of how we speak about all of the different things that we're doing, we'll continue to have a problem. I started with the story of the military in Liberia. I started with how General Williams rejected the fact that we needed to be in the room as part of the decision-making process on how the military will be conducted. I feel like our presence in that room helped to shape the Liberian army the way it is today. In Liberia, if there is a fight and the police appear, people have no regards for them. If the military appear, and not in a very violent way, people will listen when they begin to talk. If you go on the streets and do a survey, the Liberian police and the Liberian army, which one do you prefer? Ordinary citizens will say the army. Because over time, we've seen them conduct themselves in ways that citizens are very appreciative of. This, for me, has been possible because we were able to say to them, this is what we saw in the past. This is what we hope the future would be. So as we talk weapons governance, as we talk about nuclear weapons and all of the different things, let's remember that at the heart of all of these conversations, even with the inclusion and collaboration, is the impact on a human person's life. And that should be the driver in everything that we do and every solution that we find. I thank you.